All right. Well, I hear the bells ringing at Montana Hall, so that means it is time to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Paige Tollison, and I want to welcome you to the Montana Institute on Ecosystems Rough Cut Seminar Series. Next week, we will be hearing from Catherine Kelly, who is the Greater Yellowstone Manager at the Montana Land Reliance. Catherine will be speaking on land trust perspectives on sustaining nature and people in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I hope you all can join us next week for Catherine's Rough Cut, which will be held in person in the Chemistry and Biochemistry building in Biker Auditorium. As a reminder, today's seminar is being recorded, and we ask that you turn your cameras and microphones off during the presentation, and please save your questions for the end of the talk. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Andy, to introduce Dr. Arthur Middleton.
Hey, thanks, Paige. Andy Hansen, Director of the IOE. Yeah, it's really a great pleasure to introduce Arthur Middleton. Arthur is an Associate Professor of Wildlife Management and Policy at UC Berkeley. You all probably know that he's been doing very innovative science regarding migratory wildlife in Greater Yellowstone and elsewhere, and also working in the policy arena in that regard, and also in communications. Was very active with the National Geographic Year of Yellowstone effort a while back, and the various media types he used for communication with his projects associated with that were considered very highly effective. And Arthur's now in an additional role as a senior advisor for wildlife conservation at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is very relevant to the 30 by 30 Habitat Initiative and the America the Beautiful Initiative. And we asked him to talk about science and policy across Greater Yellowstone today. Arthur, thanks so much. Really happy that you could join us.
Well, thanks so much, Andy and Paige, and to this community for having me, and for that nice introduction. Just to check, Andy, am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we appreciate the opportunity to be with you all, to engage with the Institute and participants there, and especially because I think the things I'm going to talk about, a lot of it's ongoing work. It's a work in progress, and so I really like this idea and this invitation to give a little bit of a rougher talk that's pulling together some of the science, some of the policy pieces. And I hope what you hear is sort of a set of ideas and developments that are things that you can help build on and engage with, and so I'm looking forward to that discussion. What I want to do is just touch on some ideas, about some of the science over the past decade or so, some highlights, touch on some of the reasons that the communication piece has been important to me, and then go to the kind of be careful what you wish for section, which is about the extraordinary but sometimes overwhelming and daunting opportunity I've had to step over into the policy side and sort of get real and try to connect the science to conservation on the ground. So I'll jump around a bit. Thanks for bearing with me as I do that. And I'll try to leave 15 minutes or more for some engagement and discussion at the end. So I think a lot of those, sitting in Montana or anywhere else in the Northern Rockies will know about this line and have an emotional reaction to it. And for the purposes, and there are lots of things we could talk about when it comes to, the drawing of the Yellowstone National Park boundary in 1872 and all that came with that and went away with that. For the purposes of my talk today, I want to talk about how this line was drawn to protect geological features, vistas, canyons, geysers, waterfalls, and all of that. But that fundamentally, the American public and many folks in the region have come to value Yellowstone and now Grand Teton Park and adjacent wilderness areas at least as much, if not more, for the wide-ranging wildlife that exists there and in some cases have recovered there, and which roam now far beyond that line in ways that cause us to have to think about new frontiers in conservation all the time. The advent of satellite tracking, it really drives a lot of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of just science and technology developments. It just means we can see much further into the sort of hidden lives of Yellowstone's wildlife, their movements, importance to the system, what kinds of threats they face. And I would just contend, and I think many of you would agree, that these insights are really helping open up a window for conservation progress. Now, how much progress we will make, that's yet to be determined, and I think depends in part on all of us and what we do next. But I think there really is an incredible set of opportunities before us now, and right now and in the coming years, to fulfill sort of a vision for larger scale conservation in the ecosystem, and really as a model for what we can do in other places as well. I'm a little biased here, but I also think I can, because I've worked on the questions about migratory ungulates, but I also think that these have been a frontier with the application of this technology for a lot of discovery in the ecosystem, and really consonant with like what we already understood to be the really broad scale habitat needs of, say, the grizzly bear, and now we're sort of layering on a lot of understanding of these other species needs. If I could just like really crudely summarize some of the key developments in the past, say, decade plus, it's really increasing, moving from dots and lines on maps to repeatable, consistent, and rigorous ways of mapping these habitats in ways that are useful to managers on the ground. That's been a big development. It's better appreciation of the value of each habitat. I mean, I think many of you know that like winter range has been for decades treated as sort of not the only important habitat for these migratory ungulates, but has been elevated in many ways. And what we see now is that each of the components of the year-round range have important ways that they sustain these populations. And so much more of a sense now of the importance of conserving all of those year-round habitats, including the corridors that connect them. Certainly an improved understanding of human impacts, development, fences, roads, invasive species that impact habitat quality, and so on, disease is coming along with this set of discoveries, and a recognition that ungulate migration is actually quite widespread. It's not just the path of the pronghorn, and these one-off kind of amazing stories. It's actually maybe a lot more common and important to these food webs and systems than we appreciated. And I want to emphasize just this growing sense that this matters to populations and to the ecosystem. So in one piece of work colleagues and I did a few years ago, we could see that if we scored individuals in a partially migratory elk herd, this was in the Clark's Fork herd, for how well they followed the green wave, those migratory females ended up fatter at the end of the summer because they tracked that green wave more closely. And there have been other works on mule deer and reproductive performance and others starting to accumulate that show this ability to move and migrations is something that's, basically making these animals fatter or more productive. And so that's why when we then kind of, we can then suppose that when we see how widespread and important this phenomenon is, it's something that matters to the functioning and the productivity, of an ecosystem. And here I'm just sort of picking on elk migrations because we have particularly good data, and I've done a lot of work on those to suggest the richness and the power of these new data and insights. Here you're seeing about, I think, 16 partially migratory herds from 1 to 10 or 12,000 individuals in each one, major components of which total up to 20, 25,000, elk cows undertaking migrations from these outlying winter ranges up into the higher elevation core areas in the parks and the adjacent wilderness areas and national forests, each spring and summer. Leaving about May 11th, coming back about November 2nd to those winter ranges. This is something like 10, 12, 15 million pounds of biomass moving in and out of these core areas with the seasons. And so it's important. I think it's really important. And I think many of you will agree. Of course, it's not just elk. There are 8 ungulate species in the ecosystem, 6 that are known to migrate anywhere from 15 to a couple hundred miles seasonally. And those include mule deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, moose, and bison. And so while there's still work to be done to sort of build out this picture, I don't think it's unreasonable to pose that the productivity associated with these multi-species migrations sustain, biodiversity. Many of the predators and scavengers, for instance, that we know of and think about and care about in the ecosystem. Certainly, if you have visited places like Legend Rock or talked to friends and colleagues, say at the Wind River Reservation or in other tribes and reservations in the region, you know that these ungulates and their migrations have sustained important cultural and spiritual values over a long period of time. They sustain contemporary economic opportunities, hunting, guiding, wildlife watching, and so why did I put this slide in here? I think I put this slide in here because there was a time I was working with my friend, the artist James Prosek, and he kept saying, why do you keep going on about these migrations in the Yellowstone ecosystem? Why is it so important? And he sort of kept pushing me, and I finally said, look, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine we just erected a wall around the parks or the parks in the wilderness areas, and all the, crash in the system that would happen if these wildlife couldn't access shelter outside, the parks and wilderness, or couldn't, get up into the parks and the wilderness to get food in the summer and raise their offspring. And so James created this, wilderness in a box was one name he gave it, talking and thinking about that thought experiment in the system. And of course, we're not going to put a wall around Yellowstone or the wilderness areas, but is there kind of a, long-term, slow kind of death by 1,000 cuts and cumulative impacts story here? And I think there might be one specific major threat we know about, and Andy's work and his group's work has, really been some of the primary and important work on this topic relative, not necessarily to ungulates, but to biodiversity and ecologically important areas in the system, that private land development is a real threat. And I think that there's anecdotal evidence that suggests that this might be accelerating or due to kind of remote work and people wanting to live closer to nature and live in the ecosystem, and where the opportunities to do that more cheaply than Bozeman and Jackson are, which is places like Cody and others. And so, this is why David Quammen and others have said, are we loving Yellowstone to death? It's not just visitation, but it's just people wanting to own and be near this system. I'm jumping ahead here, but just fresh out, I think a few days ago, a recent postdoc in my group, Laura Gigliotti, published some new work in biological conservation. One of the insights from which was 40% of the elk winter range in the system has no real planning at the county level that it influences or limits building, for example, which is pretty eye-opening. Or less than 10% of those private lands in these key elk winter ranges have conservation easements that would limit, using on that voluntary basis development. So, this is a big issue that deserves a lot of attention. And it's going to cost a lot. I mean, it was 20 years ago, I think, that Heart of the Rockies took a stab at what it would cost, assuming there were willing landowners on a lot of the lands in the system, to carry out easements on key ecologically important lands. And I think the price tag a couple decades ago was almost $800 million. So this is important, and it's also going to need all hands on deck. I just threw this in just to flag this kind of new workout that you could look at that summarizes a lot and goes deeper. And also some work that we've just had out in the Wyoming Law Review, more of an interdisciplinary look with social science, law, and economics colleagues at questions of how private lands, what role private lands play in the future of the ecosystem. So take a look at that if you want to go deeper into these topics. Another specific challenge is, of course, the mortality and stress associated with road crossings. On the other hand, we know over and underpasses can be really effective. There's a lot of progress at the state level now, funds at the federal level that are going to help match with states and drive new construction of these crossing structures. Again, the cost is going to be high in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I think the estimated need is something like 1,500 miles of road that needs to be sort of treated, if you will, at a cost of several $100,000 per mile. So great progress, but a lot of work ahead. Fences, my student Wenjing Xu and others, including in Montana, like Andrew Jakes and Hal Sawyer in Wyoming, have really been bringing forward, I think, the extent to which fences are a constraint on the movements and thus perhaps the productivity and abundance associated with these populations. The study my student Wenjing led mapped about 4,400 miles of fences in just one county in Wyoming, Sublette County. Or Laura Gigliotti's work across the ecosystem came up with a conservative estimate of about 16,000 miles of fences in elk winter ranges in the ecosystem. So there's a lot of fences in the system. Of course, not all of them limit these wildlife, and so there's a need to really focus in and identify priorities and then arm kind of local groups and agencies with those prioritizations to sort of modify the fence that actually matters to wildlife. And so I think a really big question, and it's one I know that this seminar series wants to think about, and that I don't have the answer to, certainly not alone, and I'm hoping you can help answer this question, is just whether and how we can build and maintain partnerships across boundaries to conserve these ungulate migrations and really the ecosystem and these wide-ranging wildlife more generally. And here I'm just showing you that when we take those elk migrations, when we grab, say, the red desert to Hoback mule deer migration that's in purple here, or the famous pronghorn that moved between areas around Pinedale and up into Jackson, and if Matt Kaufman and Blake Lowry and others have maps now that show in dizzying detail the broader array of all these migrations around the ecosystem. But if we just pop these out, as we did in one recent work, you can see as these animals make their migrations, just the array of agencies, private landowners, tribes, and others that own or manage or have something to say about the conservation of their habitat or the treatment of the barriers to those migrations. And so just back to this question of how can we build and maintain partnerships across that complex array of players to conserve these wildlife at a meaningful scale. And that's something I expect to be focused on for a long time to come. But I think that there's good progress and beginnings and groundwork laid. I just wanted to zoom in a little bit more to an area that's been familiar to me and where a lot of the other things I'm showing you are sort of, aggregating existing data sets in partnership with others agencies. I've had more of a kind of original research, role in the Absaroka front of Wyoming around Cody, and just showing you here some of the data sets I and also partners, the Migration Initiative, Hall Sawyer and others have generated, put together, on a map. And you can see just in this one, local part of the ecosystem, this incredible set of connections of elk, wintering elk, deer, bighorn sheep, and pronghorn, over on the working lands and, multiple use public lands over on that part of the ecosystem. In some cases, particularly the elk and deer, over to populating Yellowstone and Grand Teton parks, in the summer, and feeding whatever it is people are looking to see in terms of, the carnivores and the scavengers over there, and providing hunting opportunity over there. So I hope this kind of work is awakening, a variety of partners to new and different connections that need to be made across the system. I think, only 5 years ago, if a biologist in Teton Park said, I think we need to think about habitat conservation over on the South Fork of the Shoshone and Cody, that would have been kind of a crazy proposition. It is not now, and we need to figure out what that looks like. Or zooming in even further, and I think really I just wanted to spend a minute talking about sort of telling the story. That's been really important to me, and one of the ways I've done that with one colleague, Joe Reese, a photographer, was just to follow one population that makes an interesting migration and try to sort of unpack its story. And for us, at one time, that was the Cody elk herd, which moved between these larger kind of private ranches over in the Graybull and the Shoshone watersheds near Cody over into the thoroughfare, inside and just outside Yellowstone in that southeast portion of the park and the system. And I won't take the time to show you lots of that work, but I wanted to just flash a few things at you that help you understand why I gained so much, I guess, passion about, how moving and important this phenomenon was, and how it was worth helping people who can't go see it themselves, sort of bringing out the story to them. And, here's just one image, aerial image taken of a place west of Cody I think this is on fall migration that the Cody elk herd is making. And they're at about probably between 10 and 11,000 feet here, headed back to Winter Range, crossing one of their 3 mountain passes that they got to cross. And there's 8 elk in the middle of this picture. You might not see them initially, but this is the scale and the drama that is typical along the course of that 60 to 70 mile migration that these animals make. Joe, I should set this one up a little better. Joe spent several years trying to get images of this migration and video clips to be able to tell the story. And about 80% of the time, things like this happen. Or, storms happen, or, other mishaps. But then eventually he was able to start bringing this story out and bringing out some really amazing pictures and moving images of what the Cody elk migration looks like and why it's compelling. And so here's one of my favorite images from that period of our work together, which Joe would say took him 800 miles on horses, back and forth, checking camera traps and all of that. But to finally just be able to show this calf sort of, probably in the first month or two of its life, struggling through this first spring migration, having just swum across the South Fork of the Shoshone and being, dragged up and down these incredible mountain passes. Just touching back on the private lands issue here, I mean, to do this work, we spent a lot of time on the ranches there outside Cody where these elk winter. And what you see is that these animals just spend an enormous amount of time on private ranches. I mean, the Cody elk herd spends about probably 80% of their time in the winter on private land. And this can bring, challenges and costs. On the one hand, as you see in the top left, I mean, that's a group of ranches and their lands near Cody. So there's an extraordinary amount of open, intact, and quality habitat that these private lands are providing. That's why these wildlife are there, right? But then on the other hand, in the words of one Wyoming rancher, this is just one way to look at the challenges and the conflicts. We love them, but when they come down out of the mountains, they're hungry. They eat a lot of forage. They got diseases like brucellosis. Increasingly, it'll be CWD. They've got predators following them that interact with livestock or with people. In the case of bears, they knock down fences, and more everybody wants us to do stuff about them, to do conservation things and all that. And we're not uninterested in that, but it's a lot, and so there's a sense of conflict, but also can we figure out ways to do this together? And that's been important insight and developing partnerships to me. And so, again, jumping around a little bit here, but back to the story, it just seemed like, there's some things that are worth detouring, from the science to make sure we also communicate to key stakeholders and publics. And I think the Wyoming Migration Initiative, Matt Kaufman, Hal Sawyer, and others who many of you may be familiar with have done groundbreaking work there. I think all of us were stunned in 2014 when Hal and Joe Reese put out this 5-minute video about mule deer that migrate from the Red Desert up to the Hoback. And, it was just a kind of a viral sensation. It's been watched almost 9 million times. So not only did it seem important to tell the story, but it seemed like people were interested in hearing the story. And so, I took inspiration from that, working with Joe and others. Still important to push out the science and do that work, but then how do we make sure we connect that to varied audiences? And so we worked with National Geographic, as Andy mentioned, a great opportunity to spend time with David Quammen out in the backcountry and the thoroughfare and look at these wildlife up close, talk about these issues, work on how to integrate that into the coverage, including in this pull-out supplement map that I was able to advise and really benefit from a lot of state and federal agency collaboration on developing with National Geographic, or trying op-eds and a book Joe published. Get it if you don't have it. It's a beautiful book. We did a multidisciplinary museum exhibit that was installed in its sort of biggest and richest, I guess, format at the Buffalo Bill Center in Cody, at the Peabody Museum at Yale, at the Museum of Wildlife Art in Jackson, the Natural History Museum in Utah. And that was more of a space we could bring people into and have, you know, symposia and conversations and have some fun. And also bring some of the landowners into it and a variety of partners to kind of get people, get the emotions, you know, flowing about why this was important, and just celebrate the phenomenon in ways that we hoped would be impactful. And so I want to shift a little bit over into the policy developments, and then more some of the developments I've become more directly involved in. One major development was in 2018. Then Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke issued a secretarial order directing Department of Interior agencies to work on enhancing big game migration corridors and winter ranges across the western states. And so this was exciting and important, and a lot of new research and some great habitat work and new partnerships have been formed, partly as a result of this policy development. In sort of parallel, but culminating in 2020, Wyoming's Governor Mark Gordon ordered the state, his state agencies to create a locally led process for mule deer and pronghorn migration corridor designation, that put together these local working groups that would consider, you know, look at the science and bring in local knowledge and review some of the key, you know, issues and threats and determine whether to elevate or recommend that for designation, and some of the policy recommendations and guidance to, for instance, land managers that would come with that designation under the policy that was created. And I want to point out that in that executive order, the governor indicated that it was important to the state to develop, and I think the way I would put this is not just to say we defer to private property rights, but to say, you know, what opportunities could be brought, you know, what kind of funding programs could be developed that would create opportunity for private landowners. And so that's been a priority that the state expressed, you know, to some federal partners and others through that executive order that you'll see me coming back around to in a minute. In my work, I've just continued to try to kind of communicate the importance of connectivity and corridors, you know, and landscape level conservation activity in a variety of ways. One of those was saying, hey, when the Biden administration's, you know, committing to conservation at a large scale, like what could that and should that look like, and where might kind of these issues of connectivity fit into it? And in one case, in the form of an op-ed, in another case, working with PERC in Bozeman, as well as GYC, Western Landowners Alliance, and a variety of others, many of which you will recognize, on trying to make some concrete policy recommendations for the transition teams when the new administration was transitioning into office. And so we were able to see that in the President's America the Beautiful an effort, sort of challenge, if you will, for state and local partners to advance land and water conservation across the country. Wildlife migration corridors were highlighted as a opportunity for early and having a need for early priority and focus. And this was I'll just say kind of a neat place in that report for pointing to the Zinke secretarial order and saying, look, this is an opportunity for good bipartisan work across administrations on something that's important to people in the West. And that basically was made clear in America the Beautiful, and I think suggests that if we continue to be thoughtful and, you know, and developing this work on corridors and connectivity, that there's broad support that can be maintained and brought to bear. In a both be careful what you wish for moment and a really exciting moment for me in my work, in about a year ago, I was asked to if I would be interested in helping at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in advancing some of these priorities. And so I accepted that invitation and took on a half-time appointment as a senior advisor for wildlife conservation at USDA, working with Undersecretary Robert Bonney and his team, mainly engaging on wildlife corridor conservation, some issues of large carnivore conflict reduction, and a few other issues. What's the science and what are the partnerships that can be brought to bear on those? Where opportunities exist at the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Farm Service Agency, the Risk Management Agency, primarily. So really farm bill conservation programs, but also working with the Forest Service, with APHIS and other agencies in USDA, as well as coordinating with the Department of Interior on these kinds of issues. And so I want to pivot a little bit into just what that work has been like as it pertains to this priority, this conservation priority of USDA now, which is wildlife corridors and particularly migratory big game in the West. And before I get into the details, I want to make it clear what a couple of key premises are for USDA's work. And really it's that you know, states and tribes generally have the authority to manage wildlife species that aren't federally listed, and state universities have a lot of knowledge about wildlife and their habitat needs. The federal government, on the other hand, has all this habitat that's managed, or that the federal government has programs to help manage where it comes to private landowners or tribes. And then on the other hand, you know, local organizations, landowners, you know, many of those folks are where the rubber meets the road and where there's passion and energy and capacity to deliver and to do the project work. And so our work has to build effective partnerships with the state and the tribes, and has to come in support of local existing partnerships, either by bringing them actual support or by getting out of the way and removing barriers. And so we kind of bring that perspective to everything we're doing here. The figure on the right is one out of a paper we published several years ago that was trying to, with Hall Sawyer and others before doing this policy work, that was trying to get at this, you know, how do we do this? We think we get the data, we can, you know, conduct some kind of, you know, assessment, evaluation of the ecology and the habitat needs and risks. And then we got to recognize the importance of the state role and authority here, and build federal and local partnerships into that. So what is our, you know, initial work at USDA looking like on this issue, and why have we done it the way that we've done it? So back in fall 2021, as a first step, we really talked a lot about where to start, and we decided that Wyoming was a great place to start. And the reason for that, and you know, why did we want to start with a focus, you know, and working closely with the state? Partly because we need to learn which USDA programs are most applicable and how they need to be adapted to really advance, you know, conservation around this priority. And so a pilot is in order. Wyoming has these diverse and abundant migrations. It has a really strong science base because of the work of all these partners in the past. There's interest from the state, as I pointed out in that executive order, in this type of partnership, particularly around private lands conservation, which, hey, the Farm Bill happens to have some tools for. And there's really knowledgeable local partners because of the process that's occurred, you know, in some of these designated corridors in Wyoming at that local level. And so we went on a listening tour last winter with some key leaders from the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. Spent time with the governor, his team, and stakeholders in the state, and really heard the importance of working very closely and following leadership of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, building, not reinventing the wheel, but building on these existing local partnerships, developing a flexible portfolio of tools that landowners can apply as flexibly as possible, given that the ecology and the, you know, kind of business needs and orientation of landowners varies widely. There was a lot of interest in habitat leasing, and the best way to describe that interest was permanent easements. That's great. Not everybody's gonna, you know, get into one. Equip and these kind of restoration dollars that can be tapped for 1, 3, 5 years is great, but we need kind of more incentives to increase habitat stewardship that can be planned around. Are there 10 or 20-year, you know, contracts for stewardship that provide sort of an intermediate option? And so we heard resoundingly that folks wanted us to try and innovate in that space. Please coordinate, you know, with these adjacent, you know, multiple use public lands. Look for opportunities with tribes. Look for opportunities to coordinate with the Department of Interior and align with that existing secretarial order. In spring 2022, USDA, after taking that feedback and those ideas into the agency kind of process, came out with some initial commitments that we were committed to this, that a new statewide big game coordinator would be permanently created. An initial commitment of $15 million across agriculture conservation easement program and environmental quality incentives program for practices or protections focused on these migratory big game seasonal ranges. And a commitment to try and build a model for habitat leasing that draws on, at least for now, these existing programs. So how could we combine the environmental quality incentives program and the conservation reserve program and a few other things to meet this need and provide 10 to 15-year contracts? So building that model, a commitment to build that model with partners. Oh, and also in last spring, took a leadership team to visit the Wind River Indian Reservation to learn about opportunities there. And so I'd say now the focus is really on starting to implement. Pretty soon, the Secretary of Agriculture and the Governor of Wyoming will execute a memorandum of understanding about this partnership, and that's coming. And we will be identifying 4 or 5 geographic priorities within Wyoming where resources and sort of capacity, staff capacity can be focused initially. some additional funding and staffing commitments, FTEs. This work needs to be additive, not just sort of piled on top of staff's existing work. And also some pending, some great progress developing a partnership at the Wind River Reservation around some of the priorities there. Something else we've been working on is, philanthropy as another leg of the stool. So how can we really work with some of the foundations interested in this to combine their resources, pool resources, and support local capacity, boots on the ground, to bring their relationships and their capacity alongside the USDA and state capacity to advance this work. And finally, we're working on a plan for the science that's going to, both ecological and social science, that we think is going to need to drive this. One example we've already executed on is supporting some work at the University of Wyoming to understand why landowners do or do not participate in some of these programs over the next 5 years. So let's, push out the offerings to landowners, but let's also, alongside that, be asking them with surveys and focus groups like why they do or don't like what they see, and use that adaptively. So I'm going to end here and just with some really general, summary observations. I think understanding these migrations and these movements and habitat needs of wide-ranging wildlife is just critically important to understanding the ecosystem. I mean, we already know that, but I think we're seeing it, new layers, depth to that understanding recently. It's very clear that wide-ranging wildlife, including these migratory, especially perhaps these migratory ungulates, matter to biodiversity, to the functioning of the ecosystem, to culture and economy. I think that this is bringing energy to collaborations at a large landscape scale. We still need to figure out kind of what all those look like. I think there's a lot of work to do. We've got policy progress, we've got new funding, but how do we assemble that in the right ways to execute and kind of tell the story of larger landscape coordination and conservation? And I'm excited. I'm having more gray hair than I did like not very long ago because of the federal and state policy work, but I think there's great progress. But there's just enormous, the flip side of that progress is there's enormous implementation work ahead, and that's what I'll be working on. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say thanks to you, and also kind of threw up this partial list of supporters or cooperators on work I've done in the past, just to acknowledge that there's just so many folks in a variety of state and federal agencies, a variety of universities, a variety of NGOs, a variety of foundations that have had, if you took away just one or a few of them, the progress wouldn't really have occurred as quickly or in key parts of this body of work. So kind of a thank you to the community that's been engaged in this work. Thanks, and I'll stop there and hope to have a little discussion. And I really want to ask you to take me where you want to go. Do you want to talk more about any of the science, or do you want to talk more about any of the policy or kind of coordination opportunities? So Andy and Paige, back over to you.
Well, thank you, Arthur, for such a fantastic presentation and all the hard work you do. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions, and I invite you to unmute yourselves and turn your videos on, or feel free to use the raise hand function or add your question to the chat.
Hey, Arthur, can you hear me?
I can.
Hey.
Mike?
Good to see you.
Oh no, there's a reporter in here.
I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's good to see
I
you.
listened in partly because I'm working on a story about a couple developments in Sublette County that are going to chew a little bit into the red desert to hoback mule deer migration. You're talking about all these programs and initiatives and funding and new positions and priority areas, and it's all planning. And like, meanwhile, I feel like there's like some of these corridors are bleeding, like they're, chunks are being taken out of them, and I'm watching it happen. I don't know, can you do you feel like that it's like kind of a race to get to save some of these places, and how do you see like all this infrastructure that you described, like how do you see that like actually working to take a subdivision that's going to have 50 houses in that migration corridor very soon, and preventing that with these tools? Like, what will that actually look like? I know that's a big question, but
Yeah. Well, thanks. And I'm glad you're working on this story, because while I'm generally familiar with the cases you're talking about, I reporting that helps bring, at least for me, bring detail and better understanding. So I won't speak specifically to those, but I will say, like, I think people, including me and partners in Cody, could bring some examples, about Winter Range or other corridors or others that are similar, maybe not as impactful, but and so I do feel like it's a race. Yeah, I do kind of feel like it's a race, and I feel a lot of stress about that, and I feel a lot of pressure about that, and yet I also, this might seem like only tangentially related, at least initially, unless I can connect it well, but I sort of feel like Mike, I've stood now, say, at the Wind River Reservation, which is the same size as Yellowstone National Park, and seen, how few staff there are, say, to work on like habitat conservation there, and then thought about how many dozens and hundreds of people we have in our parks. Or I've stood in Cody, Wyoming, and thought about, like, oh, here's the 5 NGO people who are available to like help try to bend the curve on private lands conservation here. Um, you know, in a 2 million acre area where there's all kinds of needs. And so on the one hand, I feel like it's a race and this sense of urgency. And on the other hand, it's like kind of peeling back these layers and realizing that there's a whole delivery system of people who can like have the relationships, talk to the landowners, talk to the county commissions, talk to the, and they might not be able, every development might not be that impactful, or, every habitat acre might not be possible to protect. But I guess what I'm trying to tell you is I think we have to do a lot of quick work to kind of build up the, that delivery system. And so that's a lot of what I've been, focused on, even though sometimes it's, I think, hard to show how that's immediately connected to it, those really breaking on the ground, issues. So not a very satisfying answer, I think, but I think there's just a lot of work to get the people, the boots on the ground, and the funding opportunities, in place to reflect our recognition that these private lands are really important.
Yeah, thank you.
James, do you have a question? Uh-oh, you're muted. Okay.
No, I'm sorry, I don't have a question, except
Oh, no
could you
worries.
please explicate the history of migration studies and, 600 words or less. I have it, pretty late.
I mean, I can try, but
I suppose, Olaus Murray was just watching the elk, go in and out of Jackson Hole. And so I think,
well, actually, Olaus Murray also spent, I think, in 1928, a month or more in Thoroughfare, including up on the Psorka Divide. And there's these really cool, if you're as nerdy as me about this stuff, reports that he wrote with photographs of the, hoof prints and pathways of both elk and deer in the Cody and the Clarks or the Shoshone elk and deer herds. And he talked about exactly the same stuff that I'm talking about here. So you're identifying right there, kind of, other than tribes, the first like person who really talked about that in the modern kind of network of biologists that have worked on this. And then you get long periods of not so much, and then you get the Craigheads, thinking a lot about this and talking about this, but not as recognized as for their work on the bear. And then you get in the 60s and 70s kind of a pickup where, people are using ear tags and VHF collars and all that. So, but you're on to one of the first key observers of this stuff.
yeah, I love those old naturalists, just out there picking up scat and looking at it, and
Mm-hmm.
wondering what's going on out there. And they wrote about it, eloquently, as well as, like you say, his studies.
Yep.
Paige, you see Jeff Reed's
Yeah, let's have you ask your question, Jeff, if you don't mind.
Hey, Arthur, how are you?
Hi, Jeff.
Thank you so much. I think a lot of us are as disheartened as you are sometimes. I appreciated Mike's comment, but I just really want to thank you. You are a huge inspiration to a lot of us in Paradise Valley. So my question is, my heart's here, and we're getting carved up probably faster than any private land sector in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We've got a state gravel pit that's going on, possibly on a section that has a significant antelope or a pronghorn birthing area that connects the Livingston and Yellowstone herds together. There's potential that the Arthur Blank family might do a resort right there at Dome Mountain, which is where Daniel and others of us are trying to think about a corridor. And we all love Arthur and the family, and they do great things for our area, but the pressures are just immense. And one of the things we need, and I would say as private landowners in the watershed group, is some science or some folks who can say, here are some critical areas you all hands on deck need to worry about in our area in Paradise Valley. Do you know if that's happening at FWP or elsewhere that you could help us with, the NGOs and the private landowners?
Jeff, well, first of all, thanks for the kind words about, the effects of some of the work here. I appreciate that a lot. And I, just like with Mike, I just, it's a bummer to sort of know the gap, to be reminded of the gap that we have between what I think is like the building an extraordinary set of opportunities and the little bit of time that's taking to put in place, and then how to map that onto these pretty pressing kind of opportunities, issues, challenges, conversations at the local level. So I hear that, and the worry is what propels me forward in what I'm doing. I'm sort of belaboring that partly because I don't know if I have a great answer to your question. When you mention FWP, like you're talking about the right place to go, but I also think I really kind of would be looking to people at Montana State in Greater Yellowstone Coalition. I can see like Charles and Matt and others from GYC are here. Like these are, you know, the partners that the kinds of partners that you and, you know, USDA will need to really have that information in the ways that are going to be meaningful in those conversations. And so, like, I don't have a great answer to your question, Jeff. But I think I encourage you all to like have those conversations and build up that capacity and information base, and I'll do what I can to support.
Hey, do we have time for me to ask a question, or do we need to go?
It's 1 o'clock, so if people need to hop off to their next engagement, no worries. But yeah, Andy, you should go ahead and ask your question.
And James, before that, I just want to show, I just pulled the book off the shelf. You can get this for nerds about this stuff. Yellowstone National Park Boundary Commission report. Here's Olaus Murray's, you know, one of his pictures from 1928 from the Absaroka Divide, looking at the mule deer trail. Anyway, go ahead, Andy. Sorry.
You lucky
Yeah.
duck. If somebody breaks into your house tonight, you'll know who did it.
I think you can get it for like $60 online or something. So don't come all the way to Berkeley and break me down.
Yeah, Arthur, thanks for the really enlightening talk. I wonder, with regard to national policy, it's really heartening to hear about the opportunities through Department of Agriculture and the federal government more generally with regard to these issues. And with regard to Jeff's comment question as well, I think we all suspect that individual landowners, if they had good information about the value of their property to the larger landscape, what contribution does their property make to a long distance migration, for example, in and out of the park, that might incentivize conservation even more. By and large, it seems like the federal approach now is incentive-based conservation on private lands. And I just wonder, are there some programs, vehicles in place to try to do the large landscape assessment and planning that could be quite informative about what 5% of the private lands are most valuable from a large landscape perspective, for example?
I mean, I know, let's see, are there those? I don't, the effort I'm most aware of is that, you know, Blake Lowry and Matt Kaufman's group at the University of Wyoming is developing kind of an assessment. This again is focused on the ungulate migrations, but as I hope I've convinced you, those pertain, you know, broadly to the condition of the ecosystem and sort of can serve as somewhat of an umbrella species here. So Blake Larry's bringing together the, you know, elk, mule deer, you know, moose, bighorn sheep, all the data that's available to look at this kind of this question at the ecosystem scale. So that's a USGS-led effort, Andy. As to whether there's like a broader than the ecosystem or exactly the kind of analysis you're talking about, I don't know. I mean, I know that the Forest Service is, you know, on the Gallatin in ways that's inspired, serving as a model more broadly, thinking about how to do more, you know, biodiversity, connectivity inventories, you know, more broadly. I don't know whether that kind of work is going to stop at the forest boundary. It may. So I don't have a great. I don't know of exactly what you're asking about going on. I'm aware of, there's some foundations led by the Doris Duke Foundation that are kind of trying to look at this and identify, 8 to 10 to 12 to 15, priority landscapes around the country that are that have a set of conditions that's worth focus and sort of near-term action. So I think there's a variety of relevant efforts, but I'm not aware of one grand, for that's
Yeah,
exact.
good, thanks. And I guess I was recently at a meeting in Washington, D.C., where various conservation scientists were present, and they all were familiar with the International Convention on Biodiversity type large landscape conservation planning, but none of them were aware of any programs within the federal agencies of the U.S. to try to inform the current 30 by 30 initiative and America the Beautiful initiative at the national scale or at the large landscape scale. But hopefully those discussions are out there or can come about to really give of hope of the private land incentive-based approaches being even more effective than they would be otherwise.
Andy,
So-
I think I want to go back a little bit to what Mike and Jeff were getting at, and maybe be a little bit provocative here and just say, like, I think that those kinds of analyses are important, but what I think and sort of worry is more important is, there are going to be private landowners and others who, for a variety of reasons, maybe sometimes not having the awareness they would otherwise, will take actions that might adversely impact these wildlife. So the question to me is, like, how does the conservation community make sure that there are relationships in place with those people that can deliver whatever this information is? And I think that's perhaps one of the biggest gaps that we have. In other words, for every landowner that, can positively or negatively impact these, I think we have to ask ourselves, has the conservation community and the agency community done it? Is it doing what it needs to do to be in contact in a trust-based relationship in some way, shape, or form with those landowners? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is often no. And so, to put a finer point on it, I sometimes wish, and this is, of course, I'm not totally serious about this, but, like, what if if everybody dropped what they were doing and cultivated those relationships? And of course, we're not all, it's not what we all want to do. It's not part of all of our job descriptions, and maybe some of us aren't, great at that. But the point is just, I think the relationships are the pipeline for all of this, to the landowner. And my greatest worry is that we're not set up at this time, to have those conversations. And so, just what can be done to build that up?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I hear your point, Arthur, but I feel like and we don't have to talk about the situation in Sublette County, but it's a California real estate developer. And like, why would a relationship matter there? Like, that's his purpose, is to develop and to make an enterprise. And, he sees an up and coming economic area and he pounces. So, like, what that leaves it to policy, really, and like the force of government to protect it. And like, that political will isn't there in Wyoming. It doesn't seem to be. There's an exemption in the migration order for private land. And I don't know.
Well, Mike, I believe, again, I don't know the details there, but it's been pretty close call at the county commission on one or more of those, right? And so
that's correct. Yeah.
Sometimes the relationships might not be with that developer, the landowner. They might be with the actual authority that can, that can, where one vote makes a difference, right? And also, just to be clear, like, absolutely not every case is going to be amenable to the kind of relationship and building and access that I'm talking about. I would pose that often that's going to be really important. But I guess I'd add the nuance that, like, sometimes it's going to be with the authority that is able to influence what a developer does, and other times it's going to be with the landowner themselves, and other times it's not going to matter, and and the habitat's going to be lost.
Yeah. Didn't mean to undercut your point. I'm feeling pessimistic today. Sorry.
Yeah, I feel that often too. So no worries.
Yeah.
Well, Paige, I let folks go and let Arthur go.